There are many ways you can measure the success of a video game. How many copies did it sell? Did it leave a lasting influence on the industry? Is it a game that people continue to play well past its release date? But one of the best indicators of a great video game for me is its ability to craft a world that is believable and consistent within its context. Characters that are relatable and have depth, and an atmosphere that can keep me on the edge of my seat throughout, through a combination of incredible soundtracks, graphic design, and dynamic storytelling. Some games stand out above the rest when it comes to world building. For myself and many others, video games offer a sense of escapism. Here are 3 games that I think went above and beyond when it comes to world building.
James, honey, did something happen to you?
The Silent Hill series, may it rest in peace, has become easy fodder for YouTube videos analysing scary and atmospheric games. But for good reason. The second game in the series is considered somewhat of a poster child when it comes to creating an effective and encapsulating survival horror experience. And it did so despite being released in 2001, when the graphical capabilities of games consoles were still being improved. In fact, for some, it's the unnatural jankiness of the animation that adds to the terror of the Silent Hill universe. The Uncanny Valley springs to mind. The first game in the series released for the PlayStation 1 in 1999, perhaps piggybacking off the success of the first Resident Evil game, which was released 3 years earlier. Silent Hill 1 really laid the framework for what would become a very complicated and mysterious storyline that hopped around in time and space whilst keeping one thing consistent: the town of Silent Hill. The town is what makes this series really special. The horror genre lends itself nicely to the term atmosphere, which is something that Silent Hill has in abundance. People have been banging on since the conception of YouTube about how successfully the Silent Hill games build atmosphere, so allow me to bang on some more. Silent Hill does such a fantastic job of creating a world that is uncomfortable, suffocating, and claustrophobic that it's sometimes genuinely difficult to play. The town of Silent Hill, including its map and the names of its schools, hospitals, and apartment complexes, was crafted to be deliberately generic and thus relatable. The innocuous town depicted in the series is likely akin to something that we experienced growing up, especially if you're from North America. And perhaps some of us still live in those environments today. And what's scarier than bringing horror right to your front door? The persistent fog that shrouds the town of Silent Hill in most games is suffocating, and it makes every enemy encounter a surprise. The corridors of the various buildings you must navigate are tight, maze-like, and often deliberately misleading. The graphic design, whilst perhaps crude by today's standards, uses a palette of uninviting colours that make the whole experience feel heavy and oppressive. Combat is difficult in most Silent Hill games. In fact, enemies are often better avoided than engaged. The characters that you meet throughout the series are often obtuse and unsettling, and their dialogue erratic. Maria, the first character that you meet in Silent Hill 2, is a prime example. Slight spoiler alert. In the narrative of the game, she strikes a stark resemblance to the main character's wife, Mary, and by no coincidence. What's more, Mary's behaviour is strange and unsettling in a way that's difficult to pinpoint, and her reactions to the unsettling world around her are not really situationally appropriate. Silent Hill 2 specifically comes so highly recommended by so many people, but genuinely for good reason. It's an experience, albeit an all-round terrifying one. Be sure to play this one with the lights off.
Leave us both the hell alone!
The next game I want to talk about is Undertale. Cue a deep sigh from 50% of the audience. Love it or hate it, Undertale has undeniably found success, and it was a triumph in indie gaming, particularly given that it was almost completely developed by one human being. Undertale rocked the gaming world in late 2015, and brought developer Toby Fox into the spotlight, and was real proof that a single person is absolutely capable of creating a video game experience that can inspire and entertain a global audience. I, for one, loved Undertale, and it often springs up in conversations I'm having with people who aren't necessarily gamers, as it's a game that I would personally recommend somebody even if they don't self-identify as a gamer. For me, Undertale was so successful in building such an engrossing world that it brought me back through the game at least 4 or 5 times. I wanted to continue to experience that world and discover all of the secrets that it had to offer, and boy are there a lot of secrets. Undertale obviously didn't rely on stellar visuals to achieve this goal, and folks who aren't a fan of retro graphics often have a difficult time understanding how people can be so enthusiastic about a game so pixelated. But to dismiss Undertale just because of its retro-style graphics would be a huge mistake. Undertale, despite how ridiculous and fantastical and non-sequitur some of its characters and dialogue may appear, creates a story and a setting that is completely believable in its context. The characters are strange and endearing, and their dialogue is so intelligently written that it feels like you're speaking with old friends after just an hour or 2 of playing the game. Even the characters who are trying to kill you have likable qualities, which makes the infamous genocide run a genuinely painful experience. I won't spoil any more than that. In some games, like the Elder Scrolls series or Grand Theft Auto, it's fun to mess around with characters and try to fight NPCs only to later return to a previous save file, just to see what will happen. But Undertale does a truly incredible job of dissuading you, the player, from pursuing the path of an immoral character. You really don't want to kill anybody, even the bad guys. The monsters that inhabit that world are just that likable. And the music. Never before have such simple compositions elicited such emotion in me. Even though the game is but 5 years old, listening to the soundtrack of Undertale makes me feel this weird kind of nostalgia. The soundtrack so perfectly complements the environments that you explore and the characters that you interact with. Even a well-placed lack of sound in spots such as Hotland really build atmosphere and suspense. Dog Song, the tune that plays while you fight Greater Dog, is one of my personal favourites. It is adorable. As you traverse the world of Undertale, which isn't particularly huge, you'll become very familiar with the various settlements and locations, as an element of backtracking and exploration is encouraged. Familiar characters and old friends will appear and reappear throughout your playthrough. Unless you decide to kill them off, that is. Toby Fox really has a way with words, and Undertale is the only game that I can think of that has, intentionally,
Something bugging you?
made me laugh out loud. The interactions between the Bone brothers, Sans and Papyrus, are golden, reminiscent of some of the greatest comedy duos of all time, such as Morecambe and Wise or Laurel and Hardy. Toby Fox demonstrates a sound understanding of comic timing with some of his gags, whilst also providing the characters with depth and backstories that can turn rather dark depending on how you choose to play the game. Toby weaved a very intricate web through the dialogue of his characters, which told a clear enough overarching story, but with mysteries and puzzles neatly interwoven. The internet is still trying to decide who Gaster is. More observant players and people who choose to do multiple playthroughs will definitely pick up on a few secondary plotlines and world-building details. If you haven't visited the True Lab, you really haven't played Undertale. Now, time to complete the trilogy of the internet's most talked about and overrated games. The third game I want to discuss is Dark Souls. For someone like me, a person with mild attention deficit, the idea of picking through dialogue to try and piece together the story sounded about as unpleasant as my first encounter with the gargoyles. But when it came time to actually get stuck into Dark Souls, I found that exploring this interconnected world felt natural and unhindered. The stories that exist in the universe of the Dark Souls games are to be discovered through exploration, interaction, and some assumption. Never before has a video game had me so excited to read the descriptions of the items that I collect after bashing in the skull of a skeleton with a mace, just to unlock another tidbit of information that will help to contextualize the vast world that I'm exploring. Dark Souls is unforgiving, famously. But for me, that was part of the world-building experience of the series. The world you explore as this chosen undead is supposed to be unforgiving and difficult to navigate. Any easing up of the difficulty would trivialize the trials and tribulations of our faceless hero, who is ultimately the underdog in a world stuffed with hulking behemoths and dragons ready to swallow you whole. It has to be a hard game. Because taking down a gargantuan, obese asylum demon with nothing but a rusty sword hilt is not an easy thing to do. For a game released almost a decade ago, the first Dark Souls game stands up extremely well today. Skyrim was released a month or two after Dark Souls and hasn't aged as well. The visuals are as good as they need to be, and do a damn fine job of crafting a world that is bleak, oppressive, and enormous. Dark Souls includes some truly breathtaking moments. The first time I descended that stairway into Anor Londo, I gasped. Scale is an incredibly important element in this series, and vital to how the world is formed in the minds of the players. The sheer size of everything in the game is a constant reminder that you are small. Very small, and players new to the series will very quickly learn that every hulking fortress or towering forest that you can see in the distance can eventually be reached. It's a genius way of motivating a player to continue through a game that can sometimes be painfully difficult to traverse. I recall my first time entering Blighttown, let's not mention the frame rate, and looking down to the swamp below, and wondering how in Lady Gaga's good name was I going to get down there. But get down there I did, albeit after about 50 mistimed jumps that led me into vertigo-inducing falls to my death. If only I'd known the falling trick. Every creature to inhabit the Dark Souls universe has its own harrowing story, a well-needed shock to the ego that other people have problems too. You can choose to bypass these backstories if you prefer, but the option to get really stuck in is there, and rewards explorers with a dense and juicy lore that, like some of the best movie plotlines, is open to interpretation. The story of Gwyndolin springs to mind. Spoiler alert for Dark Souls incoming. Gwyndolin is a well-hidden and completely optional boss that most players probably won't come across in their first playthrough of Dark Souls. The son of the final boss of the first game, Gwyn, Gwyndolin was raised as a daughter due to his feminine affinity with the moon, hence his looking rather womanly in the game. Gwyn is actually casting a spell over Anor Londo, giving the citadel the illusion of being sunbathed and populated, though in reality it is dark and barren. Only upon killing the image of his giant sister, and thus exposing the illusion, is Anor Londo's true appearance revealed. Gwyndolin's continuing existence as the only real god left in Anor Londo is actually hinted at primarily through the description attached to one of the objects you pick up in the game. If you never get this object, there's a good chance that you'll never find Gwyndolin. That object is the Dark Moon Seance Ring, and its description reads,
"This ring is granted to adherents of Gwyndolin, Dark Moon deity and last born of Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. The Dark Sun Gwyndolin is the only remaining deity in Anor Londo. His followers are few, but their tasks are of vital importance."
Entire new boss fights and storylines can be accessed by simply reading the descriptions of the items in-game, or by reading spoilers online. I found this a genius way of world building. And there we have it. It was very hard to choose just 3 games for this list, and I tried to choose games that were quite different from one another. I hope you liked my analysis, and whether or not you agree or disagree, leave me a comment, a like, and a subscribe. And I'll see you soon.